The moment Vincent Romano opened the envelope, every sound in the room seemed to disappear. The conversations outside his office faded. The ticking clock on the wall vanished. Even the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows felt distant. He stared at the documents inside as if they belonged to someone else's life. His jaw tightened. His fingers froze against the paper. Across from him stood Ava Johnson, a black maid who had spent the last 8 months quietly working inside his estate. Her eyes were red from holding back tears. Her shoulders trembled from exhaustion. Yet somehow she remained standing, proud, dignified, unwilling to beg any longer. The silence stretched so long that everyone in the office exchanged nervous glances. The head accountant shifted uncomfortably beside the conference table. Several senior staff members looked from Vincent to Ava and back again. Nobody understood why the most powerful man in the room suddenly seemed unable to speak. Ava lowered her gaze. She had not expected sympathy. She had not expected justice. She certainly had not expected shock. 3 days earlier, the situation had looked very different. The Romano estate stood on nearly 20 acres outside Chicago, surrounded by iron gates, manicured gardens, and towering stone walls. Every morning before sunrise, Ava arrived through the employee entrance carrying a worn backpack and a thermos of coffee. While others admired the luxury of the estate, she noticed different things. The elderly groundskeeper who struggled to walk across the courtyard, the housekeeper caring for a sick husband, the young kitchen assistant working overtime to support his family. Ava noticed everyone because she understood what it felt like to carry burdens nobody could see. That particular morning, however, the weight on her shoulders felt heavier than ever. Her younger brother Marcus had called the night before. Tuition was overdue. The university had sent another warning notice. If the payment was not received soon, he would lose his place in the engineering program he had spent years fighting to enter. Ava sat alone on a staff bench before her shift began, staring at the message on her phone. She had calculated every dollar repeatedly. The numbers never changed. Her savings were gone. Her grandmother's medication needed to be refilled. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. The only money that could solve the crisis was the money she had already earned. Money she still had not received. 8 months of work. 8 months of waiting. 8 months of excuses from payroll. She had asked politely. She had waited patiently. She had trusted the process. Yet every month another reason appeared. Missing paperwork. Administrative delays. Processing issues. Temporary hold requests. The explanations changed. The result never did. As Ava stood and looked toward the massive mansion, she made a decision she had avoided for months. She would speak directly to Vincent Romano himself. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. She knew the risk. Employees rarely approached him without permission. Most people avoided doing so entirely. But desperation leaves little room for fear. Ava took a slow breath and began walking toward the main house. She did not know that before the week was over, an envelope containing a forgotten truth would force the most powerful man she had ever met to question everything he believed about the people standing closest to him. Ava spent the next several hours preparing herself for a conversation she never imagined she would have. Every polished hallway inside the Romano estate seemed longer than usual. Every marble staircase felt steeper. Every passing employee reminded her of the risk she was about to take. By late morning, she finally gathered enough courage to approach the administrative wing where payroll and management offices were located. Sunlight poured through enormous windows, reflecting across polished floors that looked too perfect to walk on. Employees moved in and out carrying folders, tablets, and schedules. Most barely noticed her. A few did. Those few exchanged curious looks the moment they saw her standing outside the accounting office. Ava took a slow breath and knocked gently. "Come in," a voice called. Inside sat Harold Benson, the estate's senior accountant. His desk was covered with reports and financial records. He adjusted his glasses and looked up. The faint smile on his face disappeared when he realized who stood in the doorway. "Yes." Ava clasped her hands together. "I wanted to ask about my wages." Harold leaned back in his chair. "What about them? I still have not received payment for several months." His expression hardened immediately. "We have already discussed this." Ava swallowed. "I know, but my family is facing serious difficulties right now. I was hoping there might be an update." Harold sighed dramatically, loud enough for others outside the office to hear. "Miss Johnson, Payroll issues do not resolve themselves simply because someone asks repeatedly. The word stung. Ava lowered her eyes for a moment, but remained respectful. I understand. I only want the money I earned. Several nearby employees glanced toward the open doorway. The conversation was beginning to attract attention. Harold noticed it too. Instead of lowering his voice, he spoke louder. Earned, he said. That is an interesting choice of words. Ava blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Harold opened a file drawer and removed a folder. He flipped through several pages before placing them on the desk. According to these reports, there have been concerns regarding your performance. Ava stared at him. Concerns? Missed assignments. Incomplete duties. Questions about reliability. Ava felt her stomach tighten. None of it was true. She arrived early. She stayed late. She covered shifts for others whenever possible. Several staff members now stood near the hallway entrance pretending not to listen. Every word felt heavier than the last. There must be a mistake, Ava said quietly. Harold shrugged. The records are the records. Embarrassment spread through her chest. She had walked into the office hoping for help and instead found herself defending her character. I have always done my work, she said. Then perhaps management will decide differently in the future. His tone carried finality. The meeting was over. Ava stepped back from the desk. Around her, the silence felt worse than open criticism. Nobody spoke. Nobody intervened. As she walked out of the office, she could feel eyes following her down the corridor. The humiliation lingered long after the conversation ended. Yet beneath the hurt, something else began to grow. Determination. Because for the first time, Ava realized this was no longer about delayed wages. Somewhere inside the estate, someone was hiding the truth. And if she wanted justice, she would have to keep fighting for it. Ava finished her shift that evening with a knot in her stomach that refused to loosen. The humiliation inside the accounting office followed her through every hallway of the Romano estate. Even after the mansion grew quiet and most employees returned home, Harold Benson's words continued echoing in her mind. Questions about reliability, incomplete duties, concerns regarding performance. The accusations made no sense because they were not true. Ava had spent nearly 8 months proving herself every single day. She arrived before sunrise. She stayed after scheduled hours whenever extra help was needed. She covered shifts when others were sick. She never complained. Yet somehow her reputation had been turned against her. The long bus ride home felt longer than usual. Outside the window, Chicago drifted past beneath gray evening clouds. People hurried along sidewalks carrying groceries, briefcases, and takeout bags. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere. Everyone seemed to have a plan. Ava wished she could say the same. When she finally reached her apartment building, she climbed 3 flights of stairs and unlocked the door. The familiar scent of soup greeted her immediately. Her grandmother sat in a worn armchair near the window with a blanket across her lap. Marcus sat at the small kitchen table surrounded by textbooks and notebooks. The moment he saw Ava, he tried to smile. It was the same smile he always used when pretending everything was fine. How was work? He asked. Ava forced a smile of her own. Busy. She hated lying to him, but she hated worrying him even more. During dinner, conversation drifted toward ordinary things. School assignments, neighborhood news, weather forecasts. Nobody mentioned money. Nobody mentioned overdue tuition. Yet the subject lingered in the room anyway. After the meal, Marcus finally cleared his throat. I got another email today. Ava already knew what was coming. From the university? He nodded slowly. They need payment before next week. Silence settled over the apartment. Ava looked down at her plate. Her grandmother reached across the table and gently touched her hand. Do not carry all of this alone, sweetheart. Ava smiled sadly. I am trying. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Ava sat alone beside the kitchen table reviewing old paperwork. Pay stubs, schedules, employee records, notes she had carefully saved over the months. The more she organized the documents, the more unusual things appeared. Several payroll records were missing. Approval signatures seemed inconsistent. Dates did not match. Small details that meant nothing by themselves began forming a troubling pattern together. Ava stared at the papers. A feeling she could not ignore settled over her. This was not an administrative mistake. Someone had deliberately prevented her from being paid. The realization should have made her angry. Instead, it made her tired. Deeply tired. Across town, inside the Romano estate, Another man was also reviewing documents. Vincent Romano sat alone in his private office overlooking the dark grounds. Reports covered his desk. Financial summaries, staffing records, business correspondence. Normally, he trusted the people responsible for managing such matters. That trust had helped build everything around him. Yet that evening, an unusual thought crossed his mind. Earlier in the day, while passing through the main corridor, he had briefly seen Ava leaving the administrative wing. He remembered her expression. Not defiant, not dishonest. Hurt. The image lingered unexpectedly. Vincent closed the report in front of him and looked out toward the estate. Somewhere beyond the mansion walls, a truth remained hidden. Neither he nor Ava realized how close that truth was to being uncovered. The following morning arrived with a cold wind sweeping across the Romano estate. Ava barely slept. The stack of payroll documents remained on her kitchen table long after midnight, and the questions they raised followed her. Into the new day, as she stepped off the bus and walked through the employee entrance, she felt something had changed. Not in the estate itself. The marble floors still gleamed. The gardens remained perfectly maintained. The staff continued moving through their routines. But inside her, patience was beginning to disappear. For 8 months, she had trusted the system. For 8 months, she had believed the problem would eventually be corrected. Now she was no longer sure. By mid-morning, word of her confrontation with Harold Benson had quietly spread among the staff. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. A few employees offered sympathetic smiles. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody wanted to become involved. The Romano estate rewarded loyalty, and most people believed challenging management carried consequences. Ava understood their fear. She simply could not afford it anymore. Around noon, an unexpected message arrived. The head of household operations requested her presence in the executive conference room. Ava felt her pulse quicken immediately. She knew who would be there. The conference room occupied one of the most impressive spaces in the mansion. Tall windows overlooked the grounds. A polished table stretched nearly 20 feet across the room. Family portraits lined the walls. When Ava entered, several senior employees were already seated. Harold Benson sat near the far end with a folder resting comfortably in front of him. His expression carried the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. Then Ava saw Vincent Romano. He sat at the head of the table reviewing documents with the calm focus that had earned him respect throughout the organization. His presence alone changed the atmosphere. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody spoke unnecessarily. Ava stood quietly while the room settled into silence. Finally, Vincent looked up. His blue eyes moved briefly toward her before returning to the reports. "I understand there is a payroll dispute," he said. Harold immediately leaned forward. "A minor issue, sir. We have already reviewed the matter internally." Vincent nodded. "Explain it." Harold opened his folder and began, presenting his version of events. Delayed assignments, questionable attendance records, performance concerns, administrative complications. One accusation followed another. Ava listened in disbelief. Every statement twisted reality a little further. Every page seemed designed to paint her as an unreliable employee. When Harold finally finished, the room became silent. Vincent turned toward Ava. "Is any of this inaccurate?" The question should have felt fair. Instead, it felt impossible. Ava looked around the room. Every eye rested on her. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to remain composed. "Yes," she said softly. "Most of it is inaccurate." Harold immediately sighed as though disappointed. Several managers exchanged uncertain glances. Vincent remained expressionless. "Do you have documentation?" Ava hesitated. The evidence remained at home. She had not expected to defend herself before the most powerful man in the estate that day. Vincent folded his hands together. "Without evidence, I have only the reports provided by management." The words struck harder than any accusation. Ava felt the weight of the room closing around her. After months of waiting, after every sacrifice, after every extra shift, she was losing. Vincent studied her for another moment before speaking. "At this time, I am unable to approve your request." Silence followed. Complete and devastating silence. Ava lowered her eyes. For a second, it felt as though all the air had disappeared from the room. Then she quietly nodded, turned toward the door, and walked away carrying a hurt far heavier than unpaid wages. The bus ride home felt colder than usual. Ava sat beside the window watching the city blur past in shades of gray and gold, replaying every moment from the conference room. She could still hear Vincent Romano's voice. At this time, I am unable to approve your request. The words had been calm, professional, reasonable even, yet they carried the weight of a door closing. By the time she reached her apartment, the sun had already disappeared behind the skyline. Marcus was waiting at the kitchen table with a letter in his hands. The moment he saw her face, his hopeful expression faded. It did not work? He asked quietly. Ava forced a smile that convinced nobody. Not today. Marcus lowered his eyes. Then I will take a semester off. No. The answer came immediately. You work too hard to get where you are. And you work too hard to carry all of us. Silence settled between them. Across the room, her grandmother watched without speaking. She understood sacrifice better than anyone. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Ava opened an old storage box hidden beneath her closet shelf. Inside were years of receipts, letters, photographs, and paperwork she rarely touched. She was searching for anything that might help explain the missing wages. As she sorted through the documents, something unexpected caught her attention. A hospital receipt, then another, followed by several payment confirmations. Ava frowned. She remembered them immediately. Nearly 6 months earlier, the estate's elderly groundskeeper, Mr. Lewis, had suffered a serious medical emergency. He had no close family nearby and no immediate way to cover several urgent expenses. Ava had quietly used nearly all of her savings to help bridge the gap until assistance arrived. She never told anyone except the hospital administrator who processed the payments. Mr. Lewis believed an anonymous charity fund had helped him. Ava preferred it that way. She continued sorting through the box. More receipts appeared. Pharmacy records, transportation invoices, medical statements. Every document carried her name. Every document proved the same thing. While struggling to survive herself, she had spent thousands of dollars helping someone connected to the Romano estate. Slowly, an idea began forming. Not a plan for revenge. Not an argument. Simply the truth. Ava sat at the kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, organizing every document into a neat stack. She added copies of her work schedules, attendance records, and payroll notices. Then she placed everything into a large manila envelope. When she finished, she stared at it for a long time. The envelope felt strangely heavy. Not because of the paper inside, because it contained months of silence. Months of sacrifice. Months of being misunderstood. The next morning, Ava arrived at the estate before sunrise. The grounds were quiet. A light fog drifted across the gardens. She completed her duties as usual, speaking little and keeping to herself. Shortly before noon, she walked toward the administrative wing, carrying the envelope beneath her arm. Several employees watched her pass. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked questions. When she reached Vincent Romano's office, his assistant informed her that he was in a meeting. Ava nodded. That is fine. She gently placed the envelope on the assistant's desk. Please make sure he receives this. What is it? The assistant asked. Ava looked toward the closed office doors for a brief moment. Then she offered a tired smile. The truth. Without another word, she turned and walked away, unaware that the envelope she had just left behind was about to change everything. Vincent Romano did not notice the envelope until late that afternoon. Meetings had consumed most of his day. Financial reviews, property reports, and scheduling discussions filled every available hour. It was nearly sunset when his assistant finally entered the office carrying the large manila envelope Ava had left behind. This was delivered earlier, she said. Miss Johnson asked that you receive it personally. Vincent glanced up from his desk. Something in her tone made him pause. The envelope looked ordinary, worn around the edges, slightly bent from being carried. Yet the single word written neatly across the front caught his attention immediately. Truth. After his assistant left, Vincent sat alone in the quiet office. The golden light of late afternoon stretched across the polished wood desk. For several moments, he simply stared at the envelope. Then he opened it. The first documents appeared routine. Attendance records, work schedules, payroll notices. Vincent frowned. He immediately noticed inconsistencies. Dates that did not match official reports. Approved shifts missing from accounting summaries. Payroll entries marked incomplete despite supervisor signatures showing otherwise. His expression slowly changed. He reached for additional pages. The deeper he looked, the more Questions emerged. Then he found the hospital receipts. Vincent studied them carefully. Thousands of dollars. Multiple payments. Emergency expenses. Transportation costs. Prescription charges. The dates caught his attention first. They matched a period 6 months earlier when the estate's longtime groundskeeper, Mr. Lewis, had unexpectedly disappeared from work for several weeks. Vincent remembered the situation clearly. Mr. Lewis had eventually returned and explained that an anonymous source had helped him through a medical crisis. No name had ever been given. No recognition had ever been requested. Vincent continued reading. Each receipt carried the same name. Ava Johnson. The office became very still. He read the documents again. Then a third time. There was no misunderstanding. While struggling with her own financial difficulties, Ava had quietly paid expenses for a man she barely knew. She had used money she could not afford to lose. Money she herself desperately needed. Yet she never mentioned it. Not during the payroll dispute. Not during the meeting. Not even when defending herself. Vincent leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time, Harold Benson's reports began to feel less convincing. He picked up the phone immediately. "Send me Mr. Lewis." Less than 30 minutes later, the elderly groundskeeper entered the office. Vincent handed him the hospital receipts without explanation. Mr. Lewis adjusted his glasses and looked down. Within seconds, his eyes widened. "Where did you get these?" Vincent folded his arms. "You recognize them?" The older man nodded. Emotion appeared on his face almost immediately. "I have not seen these in months." "Tell me why." Mr. Lewis lowered himself into a chair. His voice became softer. "Because those papers belong to the woman who saved me." Vincent remained silent. Mr. Lewis explained everything. The unexpected medical emergency. The bills he could not pay. The fear of losing his apartment. The anonymous assistance that arrived when he had nowhere else to turn. "I spent months trying to find out who helped me," he said. "I only learned the truth recently." Vincent looked toward the envelope again. "And it was Ava." Mr. Lewis nodded. "She made me promise not to tell anyone." Another silence filled the office. This one felt different. Heavier. Vincent stared through the windows overlooking the estate grounds. Somewhere outside, Ava was likely finishing another shift, believing nobody had listened. Believing nobody cared. For the first time since the payroll dispute began, Vincent felt a deep and uncomfortable certainty. The woman he had doubted was telling the truth. And the people he had trusted most might not be. Ava arrived at the estate the next morning expecting nothing to change. Experience had taught her that disappointment usually arrived quietly. Hope, on the other hand, often came with a price. She moved through her duties as she always did, polishing furniture, organizing rooms, and helping prepare the mansion for an evening gathering scheduled later that week. Yet something felt different. Employees who normally avoided eye contact now seemed unusually quiet. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Several staff members exchanged nervous glances she could not explain. By noon, rumors had already begun spreading through the estate. Nobody knew exactly what had happened inside Vincent Romano's office the previous evening, but everyone sensed something important was unfolding. Meanwhile, Vincent sat behind his desk surrounded by documents. The original payroll reports remained open beside the contents of Ava's envelope. For hours he compared records line by line. Every new detail deepened his concern. Attendance logs approved by supervisors had disappeared from accounting summaries. Payroll requests had been delayed without explanation. Signatures appeared where they should not have been. What initially looked like administrative mistakes now resembled something far more deliberate. Shortly after lunch, Vincent summoned 2 independent auditors who managed financial reviews for several of his businesses. He gave them a simple instruction. Verify everything. No assumptions. No shortcuts. No involvement from existing payroll personnel. The investigation moved quickly. By late afternoon, preliminary findings confirmed what Vincent had already begun to suspect. Ava's wages had never been withheld because of performance concerns. The payments had been repeatedly redirected into internal review status despite meeting every requirement for approval. Even more troubling, similar irregularities appeared in a handful of other employee files. Vincent stared at the reports in silence. Harold Benson had worked for him for years. Trust had never been questioned. Yet facts rarely cared about trust. Facts simply existed. Across the estate, Ava was cleaning a guest suite when she received an unexpected message asking her to report to the main conference room the following morning. Her stomach tightened immediately. The last time she entered that room, she had left humiliated. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. That evening at home, Marcus noticed her distraction almost immediately. Something happened? He asked. Ava hesitated. Maybe. Good maybe or bad maybe. For the first time in days, she laughed softly. I honestly do not know. The following morning arrived beneath clear blue skies. The conference room slowly filled with department managers, supervisors, and administrative staff. Harold Benson sat confidently in his usual seat, apparently unaware that the atmosphere had shifted. Ava entered quietly and remained near the back of the room. She could feel dozens of eyes on her. The same people who had witnessed her humiliation were now gathered again. Vincent entered last. The room immediately fell silent. He placed a thick folder on the table and looked around slowly. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Finally, his gaze settled on Harold. I spent the last 12 hours reviewing payroll records, Vincent said calmly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Harold's confident smile faded almost instantly. Vincent opened the folder and revealed pages of documents. Attendance records, approval forms, financial audits, evidence. For the first time since this situation began, the truth was no longer hidden. And as Vincent prepared to speak again, Ava realized something she had not felt in a very long time. The balance of power inside the room was finally beginning to change. The conference room remained silent as Vincent Romano turned another page inside the audit report. Nobody dared interrupt him. The confidence that had once surrounded Harold Benson had vanished completely. Beads of sweat appeared along his forehead despite the cool air circulating through the room. Ava stood quietly near the back wall, uncertain whether she should feel hopeful or afraid. For days she had imagined countless outcomes, but none of them looked like this. Vincent placed several documents on the table where everyone could see them. These records were independently reviewed, he said calmly. Every payroll file was examined. Every approval was verified. Every claim was checked. His voice never rose, yet each word carried enormous weight. The managers seated around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Vincent continued. Miss Johnson's attendance record was excellent. Her performance reviews were consistently positive. There was no legitimate reason for her wages to be withheld. A murmur spread through the room before quickly disappearing. Harold opened his mouth as if preparing to respond, but Vincent raised a hand. The gesture alone was enough to stop him. Then Vincent revealed the hospital receipts from Ava's envelope. The papers rested on the polished conference table like pieces of evidence nobody expected to see. There is something else everyone should know, Vincent said. His eyes moved briefly toward Ava before returning to the group. While struggling financially herself, Miss Johnson used her personal savings to help Mr. Lewis during a medical emergency. Several employees immediately looked toward the elderly groundskeeper sitting near the doorway. Mr. Lewis slowly nodded. It is true, he said softly. She helped me when I had nowhere else to turn. The room fell completely silent. Some employees lowered their eyes. Others stared openly at Ava in disbelief. They remembered the accusations. They remembered the whispers. They remembered standing quietly while her character was questioned. Suddenly those memories felt uncomfortable. Vincent picked up another document. Miss Johnson never reported this assistance. She never asked for recognition. She never mentioned it. While defending herself, he paused. Instead, she continued working while waiting for wages she had already earned. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The woman accused of being unreliable had quietly sacrificed her own financial security to help another employee. The woman described as a problem had displayed more integrity than anyone realized. Vincent slowly closed the folder. The sound echoed through the room. Then his gaze settled on Ava. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ava could still remember standing in that same room days earlier, trying to explain herself while nobody listened. Now every person present was listening. Every person present was watching. Vincent finally stood from his chair. His expression carried something Ava had never seen before. Regret. Genuine regret. Miss Johnson, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. The words seemed to freeze the room. Several managers looked stunned. Harold stared at the table. Ava herself appeared unable to move. Vincent took a slow breath. I trusted reports without seeking the full truth. I allowed assumptions to outweigh facts. And because of that, I failed someone who deserved fairness. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech. Ava felt emotion rising inside her chest, but she fought to remain composed. This was never about revenge. It was never about humiliating anyone. It was about being seen, being heard, being treated with dignity. For the first time since the ordeal began, she realized that moment had finally arrived. The meeting ended, but the silence lingered long afterward. Employees slowly filed out of the conference room, carrying expressions that ranged from embarrassment to disbelief. For days they had watched Ava Johnson endure suspicion and humiliation. Now the truth stood plainly before them, impossible to ignore. Harold Benson was immediately removed from his position pending further review. Additional audits uncovered similar irregularities affecting other employees, confirming that Ava had not been the only victim. Yet none of that mattered to Ava as much as what happened next. As the room emptied, Vincent Romano asked her to remain. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long golden shadows across the polished table where so much had changed. Ava stood quietly, uncertain what more could possibly be said. Vincent opened a small folder and slid it across the table. Inside were payroll records, payment authorizations, and certified financial statements. Every missing dollar had been calculated. Every delayed payment had been corrected. Included was compensation for the months she had spent waiting, along with reimbursement for fees and penalties she had suffered because of the missing wages. Ava stared at the documents without speaking. For a moment, emotion threatened to overwhelm her. Not because of the money itself, because after months of feeling invisible, someone had finally acknowledged the truth. Vincent remained standing. "There is something else," he said. Ava looked up. "Why did you help Mr. Lewis?" The question seemed simple. Ava smiled softly. "Because he needed help." Vincent shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. "You were already struggling. That does not mean other people stop struggling too." The answer left him speechless once again. In his world, generosity often came with conditions. Favors created obligations. Assistance created leverage. Yet Ava seemed to operate by entirely different rules. She had helped someone because it was the right thing to do. Nothing more. Nothing less. Several days later, Vincent called a gathering for all estate employees. Staff members filled the grand hall, uncertain why they had been summoned. Ava stood near the back, uncomfortable with attention. She had spent most of her life avoiding the spotlight. Vincent stepped forward and addressed everyone directly. He spoke about accountability. He spoke about trust. Most importantly, he spoke about dignity. Then, in front of every employee, he publicly acknowledged the mistake that had been made. He described Ava's integrity, her work ethic, and her quiet sacrifice. He apologized again, this time before every person who had witnessed her humiliation. The hall became completely silent. Some employees lowered their heads. Others looked toward Ava with newfound respect. No amount of money could erase what she had endured. But respect, once restored, carried its own kind of power. Life gradually improved after that. Marcus remained enrolled at the university and continued pursuing his dream of becoming an engineer. Ava's grandmother received the care she needed. The constant pressure that had weighed on the family for months finally began to lift. Yet the greatest change happened inside the estate itself. Employees were treated more fairly. Oversight improved. Voices that had once gone unheard now received attention. One person's courage had changed far more than her own future. On a quiet spring afternoon months later, Ava walked through the estate gardens after finishing her shift. Flowers bloomed beneath warm sunlight. The fountains sparkled in the distance. As she passed a stone pathway, Vincent happened to be walking in the opposite direction. They stopped and exchanged a simple smile. No speeches, no grand gestures, just mutual respect. In that moment, both understood something important. Power could command obedience. Money could purchase comfort, but neither could replace character. And that day, everyone who witnessed the truth learned that dignity is worth far more than any paycheck.